Now, we're going to take a pivot. That seems to be a popular word these days. We'll go back in time, back to the 1910s. What you're looking at are two illustrations from a Swedish version of Architectural Digest. It was a magazine, a series of magazines of idealized residential environments. And so you could look at house plans, and you could look at the exterior and look at the furniture. And even in this particular magazine, there's advertisements for plumbing. And there's a picture, a beautiful picture, I didn't put it in here tonight, but of a clawfoot bathtub, and there's 6 people in it. Men and women having a bath together, all looking and laughing, and the bubbles are flying up in the air. It's humorous. The question I have, the question I'd present to you is, what happened? How did the modern design movement start? If we were here in 1910, and we're dealing with houses that are built on stone foundations, tile roofs, masonry construction, with lath and plaster on the inside, heated by coal or wood-fired boilers. What happened? What happened at that time to bring us to the next chapter, which is here? If you were born in 1910, you'd only be 25 years old when this house was built. This could be the home you moved into. Maybe you got married and built this house. 1935, Alvar Aalto. What happened? 25 years? Are you kidding me? We haven't seen this kind of change in our lifetimes. It's absolutely remarkable to me. Today we talk about technology advancing and the cloud and all these wireless methods to communicate and to do our banking and so forth. But this sort of change is absolutely remarkable. So I call it a pivot in just 25 years. We have a house here of, by the way, this home in the background that's a different building. So we're looking at this 2-floor structure in the foreground. Striking geometry with a bold facade, flat roof, upper floor extending, essentially floating over the lower floor, supported by these twin columns, metal columns. A lower closet door, an upper deck, and look at this, large panels of glass. Those didn't exist in 1910. When did they start? 1930s or so. You have to have tempered glass. You have to have machinery in order to make glass to do a sliding glass door. So along comes Anderson and Pella and some of these popular names, and you end up with this type of thing, but it's because of technology. They also had more efficient central heating. So rather than having a large basement floor area devoted to a boiler, and of course the storage of coal and wood, now you had containerized gas, maybe oil, that was a sought after heating fuel in those days. Many of us know a family that live in Denmark. They're members of this organization. And Paul, his name is Paul Olsen, is very proud of his computerized wood stove. It's a furnace. And this is a remarkable device. It's self-feeding. It has a computer, temperature controlled. It feeds the wood in. It's very efficient. There's very little ash. It puts out tremendous BTU level. But he has a barn that was formerly used by the cattle and the oxen. It's now full of wood. It's half the size of this building. And he said, well, that's the 1995 wood. This is the 2020 wood. That'll be ready in 5 years. And so you have to have this rotation of wood in order to allow the furnace to work efficiently. But nevertheless, my point is, because of conservation of space, you would be able to consider a structure like this. Now, I flipped too many pieces of paper here. If I don't write my ideas down, I'm going to forget. Okay, I do have to mention these things. Most of you know or have heard of these names and these periods. So in 1910, of those beautiful little houses, that was basically during the arts and crafts era that led up to the Art Nouveau period. Then we have Art Deco, De Stijl, and Jugendstil. Jugendstil simply means new style. And then, of course, all the isms that followed from Impressionism. Now we get into Cubism, Dadaism, so forth, Expressionism. So the art world and the design world were all taking off in these new tangents in the 1920s, the teens, the 20s, and the 30s. In architecture in Germany, Walter Gropius had started the Bauhaus School. He's noted for his words here, form follows function. Again, like I've been referring to Scandinavian design, there's an emphasis on simplicity, but also functionality. How does this device or this business, this room work? Rather than designing from the outside in, you're designing from the inside out. In many ways, you're designing from the human element. If you're designing a stool, you figure out how does the fanny strike the perfect pose on a stool, and how does that stool support the weight? So that's the functional relationship to the design. Now, Walter, during this period, and the next gentleman, Mies van der Rohe, both these gentlemen resided in European countries during the post-World War I period leading up to World War II. So they both immigrated, along with many of the physicists and scientists and so forth. Walter became the Dean of Architecture at MIT in Cambridge, and Mies van der Rohe became the Dean at Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. And once they got on American shores, then their influence exploded because of the ability and the population and the technology available here to popularize their work. In France, Le Corbusier dealt primarily with individual buildings, but he is known by historians primarily, his major contribution was in his view of cities and urban development. He had some utopian type ideas about how cities should be developed. So these were designers looking at either, here in the case of Mies, less is more, God is in the details. They're looking at technology and function, how do materials go together, and then you had another gentleman looking at larger scale. And then finally, we lead up to Frank Lloyd Wright and his influence in America. Now, Frank is a very interesting figure. Of course, he's homegrown. And he was, his thought process was pollinated, if you will, by the European influences, but also from Japan. So he became a great student of Japanese design and their wood craftsmanship and their use of space and how to divide space in elegant ways that the Japanese are known for. So he came along in the United States, which he referred to as Usonia. Usonia was a word that he coined, which meant America was a city of that the urban environment would reside in the landscape. It was his utopian version of America. Houses and buildings should be part of the landscape. They should be organic. They should grow from the landscape. Cities should come from the landscape. Today we would say this was not about sprawl. This was not about maximum floor area ratios and all this gobbledygook that we hear from planners and so forth, but rather this very elegant way to marry a building and a city to a landscape. That was his Usonian view, very idealistic and very utopian, if you will. But if you look at this building, 1930s, same time as the Aalto House in Finland, in Helsinki, you see some commonalities to the building you're in tonight. We see our connected rectangles, our emphasis on the horizontal, large windows, and then it is hunkered into the landscape. No longer do we have the heavy stone foundations that are supporting these massive blocks of construction, but rather structures that appear lighter weight and fit on the landscape and appear to float in a way. Okay, now on this slide, I need to spend a little bit of time. So if you're at home, bear with me. I hope you can see this on your screen at home. Going back to this 1910 to 1935 period, the designers didn't wake up one morning and have this eureka moment. It's like, aha, I'm going to change everything I've ever done. I'm going to design something new. No, it didn't work like that. Because of World War I, the Great Depression, the conflicts in Europe, the advancement of technology leading up to World War II, we have some incredible changes in technology. In just that period of time, you can look at the history of elements like tempered plate glass, large sheets of glass. They had to do it for cockpits, bulletproof glass for fighter planes, for wind resistant for the high-rise buildings that were starting to be erected in Chicago and New York. High-strength concrete and steel construction. Now, concrete is still being perfected today. It's getting stronger and stronger, and there's more polymers and so forth added to it. Laboratories are busy trying to make it as strong as possible and as cheap as possible. But even as early as the 1930s, you have the Romans with Portland cement, but compared to what was being built in the 1930s, it's a remarkable change, incredibly strong. The fortifications on Normandy Beach at Pointe du Hoc, the German concrete was so hard. You can visit that today. It's remarkable what those withstood, these armor-piercing bombs and so forth. But that's the development of technology. Heavy equipment, going from steam engines and small diesel engines to these massive bulldozers, urban cranes. All of this led to being able to build different buildings. The 2x4 stud balloon frame construction, that's a mouthful. In the United States, particularly in Oregon, Washington, we have lots of wood. In order to build a lot of houses, particularly in the post-war, you need to industrialize your building techniques. So unlike the lath and plaster and masonry houses of the 1910s, the materials were standardized. Advent of the 2x4 stud, 4x8 sheets of plywood. So a labor crew of 2 people could build all the walls of a standard house in 2 days, and they could erect those walls in another 2 days. Those walls go up, the plywood sheathing is nailed to the exterior skin. The interior between the studs is filled with insulation. It's pre-wired, pre-plumbed, and then you put on the sheetrock. It's a remarkable advancement in order to build houses, and it became very important after World War II when we had literally millions of houses demanded by the baby boom. Plywood and then efficient central heating I've mentioned already. I'm going to talk about plywood in a little bit. And then this is a topic that many people, scholars will lecture on by itself. It's very interesting. When you look at the development of modern design and modern architecture, what did cheap money and government spending have to do with that? Well, it had a lot to do. In simple terms, soldiers are returning from World War II. They have a GI Bill, but the builders have government financing to build thousands of houses. So they have the money on one end, they got the buyer on the other end pre-qualified, and the government is subsidizing infrastructure, water, sewer, schools, and so forth, and literally laying out square miles of development. Now, a couple of other historic changes. It's interesting. Different eras in history have had their pivots, their changes, their 1910 to 1935 period. And as I've been talking up to 1945, if some of you have studied art history, you probably know about the principle of perspective in art. 15th century, there's a famous painting. It's called the Battle of San Romani. And it's a battlefield, and all the lances and arrows and all the equipment of war are scattered around this battlefield. And the way all of these devices are laid up. They're all aiming at different vanishing points. It was the first time that perspective was introduced into art. And from that point on, from that one date, that one moment in time when that painter put his brush to that paper, that canvas, everything changed. Prior to that, geometric. After that, lifelike. Amazing period. In the 18th century, atmospheric sciences were developing. This is something I actually taught a course on in English landscape painting. The science of climatology, meteorology, humidity, all that was being advanced. And you can see it in the English landscape paintings, principally by Thomas Gainsborough. You have a couple sitting under a chestnut tree with this beautiful pastoral landscape and some livestock in the distance and rolling pastures and trees in the background. But the skies are all gauzy. You have clouds, kind of a hazy sky. That is telling you that the painter knew about humidity and he knew about weather, and he couldn't do that unless he knew about the advancement of science. So that's one of these, again, another moment, going from primary strong colors in painting to those that were moody, and they brought you into the mood of the moment. Commissioned art. The Medicis commissioned art. The Medicis paid for artists and architects to design buildings and bronze doors and all sorts of things. That's quite different to, say, Vincent van Gogh, who struggled to find buyers, who had to market his art. And later, that art became a marketing challenge. So those were some interesting moments, too. Let's see, what do I have next? Okay, before I give you some really tasty pictures, I got to say one more thing about plywood, because this is pretty cool. Okay, you think, why did I come here tonight to learn about plywood? This is ridiculous. Well, here's why it matters. The wood, of course, is a primary component of buildings. And plywood, like on the stud frame walls, you can't have plywood unless you have a way to create veneer, to make those little thin layers of wood. And the little thin layers of wood, the veneer, that's no good unless you have an adhesive. So all of these forces came together. Now, is that actually Alfred Nobel, TNT and Nobel Prize, his father. His father developed the first rotary lathe in Sweden. This was in the late 1800s. So he was able to carve off these really thin layers of veneer from birch trees. Great. Okay, so what do you do with it? Well, he was experimenting in different ways to do that. Then along came a gentleman in, of all places, the St. John's neighborhood in Portland. This fellow's name was Gustav Carlson. He owned the St. John's box factory. He was the first one that thought, I think I can glue all this stuff together. And his plywood was used in the World's Fair in 1905, the Lewis and Clark Exposition, in a prototype house. Very crude, it delaminated, but it worked. He figured out with glue and pressure, you can create a panel, and you can use that for a house. The problem with delaminating, the glue wasn't very strong. So in comes this fellow named Nevin, a Scotsman in Aberdeen, Washington, who owned a sawmill. He developed waterproof resin, sold the patents and so forth. And today, of course, we have synthetic resins. But the advent of plywood began with a Swedish lathe, was carried farther by Gustav Carlson in the St. John's box factory, but he needed the glue that was made up in Aberdeen, Washington. It's remarkable, these little points of light come together and converge, and today we have plywood, and everybody, you have a piece of plywood, you go to Home Depot, buy a piece of plywood, you don't even think about it. But there's a story to tell there. It's remarkable. It wouldn't have happened. Plywood is so important that it contributed to the war effort. The de Havilland Corporation built the Mosquito twin-engine bomber out of plywood. This little plane fighter bomber could go 360 miles an hour, made of wood, plywood struts and plywood components. PT boats made of plywood. Who would have thought Scandinavians contributed to that? Okay. Enough of the dry stuff. Let's summarize. Of course, we know about the social democracy in the 1950s, community-based living. We know about technology. Beauty, simplicity, minimalism, and functionality seems to be a theme that goes through Scandinavian products, Scandinavian life in a way. Functional everyday objects should be affordable to all. That's an aspirational statement that has been tossed around for decades. And then increased availability, and it goes back to the affordability point about low-cost materials and mass production. If you have enough of it, prices go down, and then you can build things that most people can afford. Now, with concrete comes some innovation. Jorn Utzon started the Sydney Opera House. He started struggling with that design in 1947. He was commissioned after he won a competition. He had many cost overruns. I think he was fired and rehired twice, maybe 3 times. The government was very impatient with him. But these large sails, this was his major thought, was these are built of concrete. Up to that time, there wasn't any way to make that. So he had to build prototypes. He had to figure out a way to create that concrete shell. And these are thousands of tons in weight. Once he perfected that and developed the technology behind that, then it was relatively easy. And I think he died before he passed away. He was given the, I don't know what it's called in Australia, but it's like the equivalent of being knighted in the UK, getting the order, the OBE, Order of the British Empire, but very revered for his contribution, not just to the icon of Sydney Harbor, but to what that building represents from a technological standpoint. Oops, wrong button. Saarinen, I was visiting with Saarinens earlier. This building, or this structure, is remarkable because it is, of course, it's an icon. It's the gateway to the west, St. Louis, right on the riverfront, Missouri River. Remarkable in that it's stainless steel. It reflects the sky. If you're there in the late afternoon with an amber sunset, it turns pink on top. It's amazing. This is aeronautical level construction and design. Had to go through wind tunnel tests and so forth. It's remarkable achievement because you think about just several decades earlier, compare this to the Eiffel Tower, in which the bulk of the Eiffel Tower are the legs at the base in order to support the weight of that slender tower that goes way up to the sky. It's an erector set. Now you have this on this diminutive platform on each side, and that's able to withstand the winds of the Middle West, tornado strength. And the cool thing about it is you go all the way to the top and go up there and look through the window. Look down on the river. It's an incredible achievement. I just get chills. It's fantastic what people have done and what they have been able to think about and come up with an idea and get it built. But this elegant simplicity, again, demonstrates the Scandinavian, the guiding principles. Two more examples. Anyone who's been to Finland, to Helsinki, has probably been to the Church in the Rock. I've been there twice over a span of 50 years. It's remarkable because it sits inside this rock pit. Here's the altar, sanctuary. And then you have this sort of a UFO that's suspended on these wooden girders. So it just floats there, has this magnificent light quality. And during the day as the sun comes around, even in the winter days when the days are short in Helsinki, you do have a low sun angle, so you can imagine the sun coming through and illuminating that ceiling. So this whole light pattern is quite remarkable. This is a relatively new building in Reykjavik. The thing that's interesting about this are these glass panels. They function as prisms. Now, of course, they're highly insulated. They have an insulation value, but these create a light pattern. And at certain times of the day, this picture doesn't show this. It'll put on these walls, these beautiful, the whole spectrum, the whole rainbow of colors. And so each of the four sides of the concert hall has these glass prisms. I can't imagine how much they weigh, but they're the size of this table, this platform I'm standing on. Very thick. Down here, there's a lounge. These are all individual dining tables and lounge chairs. And then these are the portals into the concert hall right here, and a restaurant down below.